From the Diary of Friedrich Albrecht from Bremen, Free Imperial City of the Holy Roman Empire, 12th of April, 1711. Tomorrow we sail for the Cape. Mother wept as I packed my chest, though I tried to smile. The Dutch East India Company promises land and work, but I know little of Africa, only that it's far, hot and strange. I carry my Lutheran psalm book and a small carving of St. Michael. May God guide me beneath foreign stars. Long before Germany became a unified nation, thousands of Germans arrived at the Cape, not as colonial conquerors, but in quiet waves. Soldiers in Dutch uniform, skilled craftsmen, and later, missionaries bearing the gospel. The journey was long, the land unfamiliar, but for many, Southern Africa became a place to begin again. This is their story. Hello, I'm Dr. Philip with Lost History Files. If you enjoy exploring hidden stories like this, please subscribe, like and share, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thanks so much to those of you who've already joined the journey. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so do drop a comment below. In this episode, we turn our attention to another significant group of immigrants to Southern Africa. What drew Germans from familiar forests, towns and farmlands to the distant shores of the Cape, and later to other regions of South Africa? How did they adapt to and shape the local cultures and landscapes they found? And what is their legacy today? Stay with me as we open the Lost History File on the Germans in South Africa. Our story begins in the late 17th and 18th centuries, a time when Europe was a mosaic of shifting powers and restless peoples. What we now call Germany was then a fragmented landscape, part of the Holy Roman Empire, duchies and principalities, bishoprics and free cities, each with its own laws, languages and loyalties. For many, life was a struggle against poverty. The echoes of religious turmoil, the 30 Years' War of 1618 to 48, still haunted the land, and opportunities were scarce. Yet beyond the horizon lay a new world, unknown, daunting, but ripe with possibility. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, had carved out a small but strategically vital outpost at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652, a watering stop for ships bound for the riches of Asia. To build and defend this remote station, they called not only on Dutch and French Protestants, but also on the skills and courage of Germans, soldiers, farmers and craftsmen willing to brave the unknown. Unlike the Huguenots, who fled religious persecution, these Germans came not as refugees but as seekers, drawn by the promise of a new start, away from the hardship and divided loyalties of home, and by the enticing prospect of Vrijburger status and land ownership. What's often overlooked about the VOC is just how international its ranks truly were, and how profoundly Germans shaped the early Cape Colony. The company needed skilled hands and sturdy backs, soldiers, sailors, carpenters and blacksmiths, to hold and build this distant outpost. Meanwhile, the German lands, still fractured and without colonial ambitions of their own, were filled with men ready to seek their fortunes abroad. Regular pay and food were enticements in themselves. Initially, recruitment focused on the Dutch Republic, bustling port cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam and Middelburg, where many German immigrants had already settled, and often spoke Dutch. But the Dutch population was relatively small, and the VOC's reach was vast. So the company turned to the German patchwork, states like Brandenburg, Hesse, Württemberg and Hamburg, places full of skilled men eager to begin anew. VOC recruiting agents crisscrossed these regions, recruiting Soldaten, soldiers, as well as sailors and settlers. Many early Cape settlers with recognisably German surnames like Berg, Müller, Schmidt, Koch, Bauer and Brandt began their journeys as VOC soldiers or sailors. Let me acknowledge here that the pronunciation of German words varies across South African communities. Some pronounce them in the original German way, while others use Afrikaans or English forms. By the time they reached the Cape of Good Hope, they were already bound by VOC contracts, men caught in the tides of empire, far from the towns and valleys of home. Between 1652 and the end of Dutch rule in 1806, approximately 15,000 immigrants from German-speaking territories made their way to the Cape. Though the Dutch flag flew over the colony, its story was written in many tongues, and the German voice rang loud and clear. Once on South African soil, German recruits, mostly soldiers in Dutch service, quickly became vital threads in the fabric of colonial life. Their primary duty was to defend the fledgling colony, guarding against rival European powers, and resisting the incursions and reprisals of indigenous peoples. Most Germans served in the lower military ranks, soldiers, corporals and sergeants, or Soldaten, corporals and Sergeanten. They were stationed at the Castle of Good Hope, the oldest surviving colonial building in South Africa, as well as in the VOC's company garden and adjacent barracks. Beyond the settlement, they were deployed to outposts and redoubts along the Liesbeek River, forming a military frontier against Khoikhoi and Sun resistance. One such post was Fort Kornhoop, a defensive stronghold on the edge of Cape Town. German farmers came too, with a wealth of agricultural knowledge honed across Europe's diverse climates. Some were granted free plots, others leased land from the VOC, but all played a crucial role in building the backbone of the Cape's economy, agriculture. The VOC envisioned a self-sustaining colony, one that could provision passing ships and feed its growing settler population. German farmers helped make that vision a reality. They planted vineyards, cultivated grain fields and raised livestock, skillfully adapting old world techniques to the Cape's unfamiliar soils and shifting seasons. Not all Germans arrived bearing rifles or ploughs. Some came armed with chisels, hammers and tuning forks. Among the early immigrants were goldsmiths, clockmakers, organ builders, bookbinders and brewers. Their craftsmanship shaped both sacred and secular life. Altarpieces carved by German hands, beer brewed to time-honoured recipes, and intricate timepieces that graced the parlours of Cape elites. Some also found success in commerce. A striking example is Heinrich Eckstein of Saxony, who arrived in 1702 as a 24-year-old VOC soldier, penniless and unknown. By 1731, through shrewd trade in wine, meat and soap, he had become the richest freeburger at the Cape, owner of 7 farms, 6 town properties, vast herds, 50 horses, and flourishing wheat and vine holdings. At the heart of German identity at the Cape lay the Lutheran faith. For many immigrants, religion was the glue that held their community together, offering comfort, structure, and a spiritual tether to their distant homeland. For decades, before a single Lutheran church stood in Cape Town, German settlers practiced what we might call a quiet form of spiritual resistance. The VOC resisted calls for a Lutheran church for more than a century. It governed the Cape not merely as a trading outpost, but as a tightly controlled colony, and the Dutch Reformed Church was seen as central to that control. Allowing a separate Lutheran congregation, largely composed of German soldiers and settlers, threatened to subvert religious unity, and with it, social order. But faith, as history often shows, does not yield easily to power. So the faithful gathered in secret, in private homes, behind shuttered windows, beneath low candlelight and heavy curtains, sometimes even aboard ships moored in Table Bay. These underground services, often led by lay preachers or sympathetic chaplains, were held in German, whispered in psalms, sustained by faith. Petitions were delivered to the VOC, earnest pleas for recognition, year after year. When the Strand Street Lutheran Church in Cape Town finally opened its doors in 1780, it marked more than the founding of a congregation. It was the culmination of a long, quiet struggle, a triumph of spiritual perseverance and communal identity. This church, and those that followed, became the heart of German life at the Cape. More than places of worship, they were cultural sanctuaries. Here, language and tradition were passed down, baptisms and weddings, Christmas pageants and community feasts, moments that wove generations together. In the 19th century, a new wave of German immigrants arrived, missionaries. Missionary societies sent men and women driven by a profound religious calling and a belief in education as a force for empowerment and transformation. There were few objections from the British, who had held colonial power since 1806. To them, mission stations were more than places of worship. They were instruments of order, a civilizing influence in unsettled territories. German missionaries rarely challenged political authority. They viewed their spiritual work as standing above politics. Instead, they focused on scripture, schools, and service. Often, they worked closely alongside British Anglican and Methodist counterparts, forming a broad ecumenical and internationalist front of spiritual outreach. These missions sought not only to convert, but to educate and support indigenous communities. From Prussia's disciplined heart, the Berlin Missionary Society journeyed south into the rugged interior of South Africa. Founded in 1824, their mission was clear: to bring the gospel to those untouched by European faith. They faced not only language barriers but deep cultural divides, and yet they persevered. They established mission stations such as Botshabelo and Emmaus, planting not just churches but whole communities. The Berlin missionaries were scholars as well, immersing themselves in African languages, recording local customs and printing scriptures in Setswana and Sepedi. In doing so, they became unexpected custodians of cultures they never claimed to own. By the middle of the 19th century, new missions began to arrive. From the Rhineland came the Rhenish Missionary Society, venturing into the arid dust of Namaqualand and beyond. They carried Bibles, chalkboards, and medicine, building churches and schools where few had stood before. In a world suspended between tradition and colonization, they offered a middle path, a bridge, fragile and imperfect, between two worlds. From the village of Hermannsburg, deep in the heart of Germany, another mission took root. The Hermannsburg mission focused on Natal, evangelizing among the Zulu people. Steeped in Lutheran discipline and bound by steadfast faith, its missionaries did more than preach. They lived alongside the community, listened attentively, and, crucially, taught. Local converts were not only nurtured as followers, but trained as future leaders, pastors, teachers, and translators. Here, faith met endurance, and in that meeting, something new began, an African Christianity, shaped not only by German hands, but by African hearts and minds. Mission stations were more than outposts of faith. They became vibrant centres of education, agriculture, and healthcare, places where literacy took root, where hymns were sung in new languages, and where futures began to shift. Their work left a profound and lasting imprint, not only on spiritual life, but on educational opportunity and cultural exchange. It was in the classroom where German missionaries perhaps made their greatest mark. Church-run schools laid early foundations for literacy and learning. For generations of South Africans, these schools were often among the few places offering formal education. German missionaries believed literacy was essential to understanding the Bible, so they established schools teaching reading, writing and scripture, alongside arithmetic, handiwork, nature studies, local history, geography and singing. Yet their role in colonial life was far from simple. On the one hand, they acted as advocates, sometimes standing between indigenous communities and colonial authorities, arguing for rights, fairness and protection. On the other hand, they were agents of change, introducing foreign beliefs, reshaping traditions and, whether intentionally or not, displacing parts of the cultures they encountered. This duality, the missionary as both healer and disruptor, teacher and outsider, remains one of the most complex and enduring legacies of German influence in South Africa. German missionary work extended beyond the Cape Colony, leaving a particularly strong mark on southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia. From 1884 to 1915, Germany ruled the region as a formal colony. Though this imperial chapter was brief, its imprint remains profound. Towns like Swakopmund still bear the hallmarks of German architecture: sharp gables, pointed towers and neatly planned streets. Missionaries once again played a central role, establishing churches and schools, introducing Christianity and Western-style education. Yet this legacy is shadowed by violence. The Herero and Namakwa uprisings and the brutal reprisals that followed stand among the most painful chapters in Namibia's history. They remind us that the missionary story cannot be separated from the wider, sometimes darker story of empire. And yet, amidst the contradictions, German culture took root. Today in Namibia, Lutheran hymns are sung in the Oshiwambo Bantu language, and Christmas markets share space with traditional music and dance. Wherever Germans settled, books followed. Ministers, schoolmasters and artisans brought more than tools or seeds. They brought words. Bibles, hymnals, catechisms and primers, printed in German, copied by hand, read aloud by candlelight. At the Cape, this gave rise to one of the earliest forms of Lutheran publishing in southern Africa. South Africa's landscape still carries echoes of German heritage, especially in its place names. The most prominent cluster, including Berlin, Hamburg and Potsdam, lies in what was British Kaffraria in the Eastern Cape, settled initially in the 1850s by settlers of the British-German Legion, veterans of a Crimean War they trained for, but never actually fought in. Some 2,000 German military men were settled in the area by the British in 1857, particularly around King Williamstown. Why not return to Germany? Fear of the reception they'd receive, having served a foreign power. The idea of the British was for the men to form a buffer zone in an Eastern Cape long scarred by the Xhosa Wars, which raged from 1779 to 1879. Their commander was Baron Richard von Stutterheim, a colourful Prussian general who offered his services to Britain in 1854 during the Crimean War, after the Mexican president he had raised German troops for was deposed. The Kaffraria town of Stutterheim was named in his honour. The Bauer family from Westphalia was part of a later wave of German immigration to Kaffraria in 1878. 10 ships, bringing around 1,900 souls, were chartered for this group. Hermann Bauer, aged 28, and his British wife, Marie, 21, together with their small child, Marie, left Hamburg on the 31st of March, 1878, on a ship called Papa. They arrived at East London 4 months later. What hopes and fears must have stirred in these hardy passengers on their journey. and what motivated them to leave behind familiar villages, farms and communities for another world. Herman was a Landarbeiter, an agricultural labourer without land of his own. The South African immigration scheme offered him a lifeline, the chance to lease at least 20 acres of Crown land per adult, with free passage to the Cape thrown in. All settlers were personally interviewed and vetted by the Immigration Board upon arrival. The Boers evidently met the board's criteria, preferably married couples under 50, of respectable character, hard-working and resourceful. Initially, the settlers were housed in tents and given rations, before being transported by ox wagon to the small holdings chosen for them. Herman and Marie were allocated a farm called Lorraine, in the Blue Ocean region of Upper Kweleja, now Kweleja, north of East London. Most men worked as farmers or craftsmen in the area, while the farmers' wives traded farm produce, dairy and vegetables, at what was then known as the German market. Nothing came easily, especially in those first lean, anxious months. Abject poverty and disease, including scurvy, were common. A report by the district surgeon, Dr. Faley, makes for sobering reading. I have within the last few days visited the German immigrants in this district. The greater number of them appear to be in a very destitute condition. Their crops are not coming up, owing to the long drought, and many of them have barely sufficient to keep body and soul together. Scantily clothed and half-starved, they have been reduced to a worse condition than any I have ever seen, even in pauper practice in London. Diseases brought on by want and exposure are rife among them, and unless immediate steps are taken for their relief, many will certainly succumb to their hard life. The government was compelled to step in and provide emergency assistance. But after these initial trials, Herman and Marie, like other settlers, began to prosper through sheer hard work and determination, establishing themselves as successful farmers and growing their family. The Settlers' Monument on the East London Esplanade stands in honour of the German immigrants to British Kaffraria. Unveiled in 1961, it was funded by the then West German government and by nearby towns like Braunschweig and Breitbach. Mosaic plaques near the monument highlight the various stages of settler development. Not all the Germans in this immigration scheme became part of the Kaffraria German community, or Kaffraria Deutschen. Because of ongoing conflict with the Xhosa in the east, many were diverted to Cape Town rather than their intended destinations. There they introduced intensive vegetable farming methods in Philippi, on the fertile, sandy soils of the Cape Flats, and built homesteads, churches and schools. Most of Cape Town's fresh produce is still grown here to this day. In KwaZulu-Natal, the settlement of New Germany, within the Durban area, was founded in 1848. It was populated by around 200 Germans from the Osnabrück-Bremen area, as part of the Natal Cotton Company scheme, set up by German Jewish businessman Jonas Bergthal. Alongside New Germany, this province is home to Hermannsburg, whose Mission House Museum is the oldest building in the province, as well as Muden, New Hanover and Wartburg. While Pietermaritzburg does not bear a German name, it holds strong missionary ties, and many surrounding farms and estates still carry German names linked to early settlements. The Western Cape bears its own German imprints, in towns like Arnholzschmidt, the former name of Haarlem, Heidelberg, Lüneburg, Potsdam and Wuppertal. German influences also linger in street names and historic estates, particularly around Cape Town. Further north, Gauteng province includes Heidelberg, and in the northern Cape you'll find Hanover, roughly halfway between Johannesburg and Cape Town. But again, the German contribution to South African history is best understood through the lives of individuals whose stories lend a human touch to the larger migration narrative. Take Georg Schmidt, for example, an 18th century Moravian missionary from Saxony, the first missionary to South Africa. In 1737, he established the first mission station in southern Africa. Schmidt was more than a preacher. He was a listener. He respected the Khoikhoi language and culture, a radical stance for his time. Then there was Heinrich Smellen, a German missionary who arrived in southern Africa in the early 19th century. Known for his work among the Nama people, Smellen translated Christian texts into their language and helped establish one of the first mission stations in what is now Namibia. Reflecting on his arduous journeys through Namaland, he wrote, "The land was rocky and hard to travel. I couldn't keep a horse, so I rode an ox. With my Bible and karos, I preached across vast areas. Though hunger and thirst were constant, the Lord strengthened me daily, and by his grace I endured." His words, simple yet profound, capture the hardship and faith that defined many German missionaries living in Africa. Karl Wilhelm Posselt, from Neumark, Prussia, was a German missionary of the Berlin Missionary Society. He worked among the Zulu in Natal and later served the community of New Germany. Posselt was famously known as the missionary with the violin. However, one diary entry, written in the stark missionary language of the time, strikes a despondent chord. "After having worked myself weary through the week, when on Sunday I saw these wild men of the wilderness sitting before me, absolute obtuseness towards everything divine, together with mockery and brutal lusts written on their faces, I sometimes lost all disposition to preach." Such raw candour reminds us of the cultural and emotional chasms, the limits of their own understanding and empathy which early missionaries grappled with. Contrast this with Karl Hugo Gutsche, a settler from Saxony who earned the trust of the Xhosa people, so much so that they gave him a ceremonial name, Umchocho. Gutsche wasn't just a farmer. He was a bridge builder between cultures, learning the Xhosa language and engaging in local customs, proving that mutual respect could flourish even across vast divides. Johann Franz Draeger was a pioneering German botanist whose explorations across 19th century South Africa introduced thousands of plant species to European science. Braving rugged terrain and vast distances, he meticulously documented the region's rich and diverse flora, leaving a legacy that continues to inform and inspire botanists today. German lineage also shaped the leadership of the Union era. J.B.M. Hertzog, Prime Minister of South Africa from 1924 to 1939, bore a distinctly German surname and traced his ancestry to recent German forebears. A staunch advocate of Afrikaner nationalism, Hertzog championed a path of cultural independence from British influence, and his pursuit of a self-defined South African identity left a lasting imprint on the nation's political landscape. What of the German legacy today? Though the first German settlers arrived at the Cape centuries ago, their story is far from finished. Their legacy continues to thrive in South African culture, business, and identity. Across the nation, many Afrikaner families trace part of their heritage back to German roots. Surnames like Meyer and Schmidt remain common, living echoes of German migration that have become thoroughly South African, yet still carry the imprint of their origins. In Cape Town, Johannesburg, and other cities, German cultural organisations bring to life Christmas markets, folk music evenings, and traditional dance events, vibrant echoes of Germany itself. These aren't just relics of the past. They're living traditions, nurtured by people who feel proudly South African, while warmly connected to their German ancestry. German language education and media continue to play a quiet but enduring role in South African cultural life. Several German schools, such as the German International School in Johannesburg and Cape Town, offer bilingual education, rooted in both German and South African curricula, serving not only German-speaking families, but also those drawn to international education. Within South African media, German culture is actively promoted primarily by the Goethe Institute, which preserves the German language and fosters cultural exchange, ensuring that the legacy of German migration remains vibrant, relevant, and forward-thinking. Historically, German-language newspapers such as Südafrikanische Volksfreund, the South African People's Friend, also played an important role in maintaining the cultural connection. Meanwhile, AZ, a German-language newspaper in Namibia, has been in publication since 1916. The tender tears of Friedrich Albrecht's mother, and of countless others like her, are understandable. She likely never saw her son again. Yet, though their life was never easy, many of the German soldiers, settlers, and saints who crossed the ocean to a new world were rewarded. They found their calling at the Cape, and a new Heimat on the High Veld. Without them, the rich and complex story of South Africa would not only be incomplete, but diminished.